What do Muslims think about science and evolution? This week, I have Dr. Shoaib Malik, my co director with the Abrahamic Theistic Origins Project at Oxford University. He and I are going to discuss the history of science as an intellectual development in Islam. And then, how do they think about things like evolution? How do they process the questions? What kinds of questions do they have that Christians may not have about evolution? He's a great friend, and everybody I know thinks he is a fantastic person. I think you will too. Stay tuned. Maybe you could tell us who you are and how did you become a professor of religion and science at the University of Edinburgh?
Okay. Wow, that's a long story, but I'll try and get to the main points. So I come from a very typical, Muslim background. My parents were migrants. My dad was born and raised in Kuwait, right? His father moved over when he was very young, or when he was just born. I was born and raised in Kuwait, so me and my brother, we were twice removed from our host country. And I went, interestingly, despite the accent, I was in a British school my whole life. Did my A levels, and then when I was 18, I looked at my grades. I'm good at math and chemistry, chemical engineering. That's the way to go.
I do want to point out you were raised in British schools, and yet for our audience, he picked an American accent. We won. One for America.
Whether it was
Look,
picked,
we need a win. We need a win right now. So.
Okay, whether it was picked or genetically there, I'm not so sure. We can have that debate. But yeah, I went for chemical engineering, and I went to the University of Bath for my undergrad, and I excelled really well at it. So I actually got a full scholarship towards the end of that program for a PhD at the University of Nottingham. So I didn't do a master's, went straight into a PhD program.
So all in the UK.
Yeah, all in the UK, and that was in Nottingham. So I was really, happy with the change. Otherwise I was going to go for an MSc at Imperial. I got accepted for an MSc in chemical engineering. Now the PhD is where everything changed for me. So my professor, his name is Sean Rigby, and he is pretty much my example of what it means to be an excellent PhD supervisor. He's one of those guys who would always give you the time whenever you ask for it. Like even if he's incredibly busy, he'll make time for you. So, and I remember Professor Rigby, he was like always asking me questions about Islam. Now, bear in mind, I grew up as a cultural Muslim, so I didn't even know the basics of Islam when I was 18. And
we have a parallel in Christianity as well.
Okay, good, cool. Did I know that person?
No. I'm saying cultural Christians.
Oh, okay,
Who know like Jesus died, he rose, he'll save you. But that's it.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. So, I would go to Friday prayers. I'd do the 5 prayers sometimes, right? But I wouldn't know why or what I actually believed. And it was actually my supervisor who started asking me questions about Islam. He could tell from my name, my background, he's probably Muslim. And I had no clue. And this guy is a Cambridge graduate. So whenever you sit next to him, you already feel like an idiot. And then I felt like an even bigger idiot by not knowing the answers to these questions. And so that set me on a particular track. So I started researching, I started reading about Islam, I started reading about philosophy in particular, and that opened up a whole new world for me. So I started off with Plato, and I remember I was just so in love with Plato. Like I loved his dialogues. And so by the end of the PhD program, I just knew I was in the wrong field. I just knew that this is not something I was going to specialize in. I always wanted to be an academic. That was clear to me. I always wanted to be a professor, but not in chemical engineering by the end of that degree. And so naturally, if you come from a Pakistani background, telling that to your parents,
I want to leave chemical engineering for the humanities.
So, we had some hard conversations. But what ended up happening was, and this is something my dad advised me, because I remember having a chat with him in the second year of the program. And this is for your American folks, PhD is only 3-4 years in the UK, so it's not like a 5-7 year program. So the second year, I remember having a very heart-to-heart talk with him. He said, "Look, you're halfway in, just finish. It'll put food on the table. At the very least, that's what it'll do."
Yeah.
And so that was solid advice. I stuck through
Wise.
it. And lo and behold, shortly after, I was teaching chemistry at a university in Dubai. So when I finished my degree, my parents moved from Kuwait to the UAE, and so my dad said, "Why don't you move back with us? But we're not in the UAE." I'm like, "Okay, why not?" So I went back to the Middle East. That was a very edifying experience, moving into different culture. The UAE culture is not the same as the Kuwaiti culture. Of course, some similarities, but also some differences.
Right. What would be, sorry, because I think a lot of people are like culture shock between two places on the Arabian Peninsula. What's different?
Oh, so for example, the dialect is different. You're not going to have the same dialect, right? Also, some of the ways that people behave, eat, food, drink references, all of that also change. But it's not like a massive difference. I'm not talking about going from France to somewhere like Zimbabwe. That's a
Right.
radical difference, right? This would be more like going from the US to the UK.
Right.
You
Okay.
have some commonalities, but you
Right.
also have some noticeable differences, right?
Yeah.
And that was very good. So I was in an all-girls university, and this university, Zayed University, was specifically designed for women in the in the UAE, because there were many other universities that were catering for men, but the founder of the UAE wanted to have a specific dedicated place for women, and so all the programs for women, and I was responsible for teaching the chemistry modules, for environmental science, as well as public health and nutrition. And so these were foundation programs. So you have like big batches coming in, right? And it was very good. It was very fun. I got to sharpen my teaching style. I got to know a lot about the admin side of the university world, because this is my first gig
Fun.
right
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
my first gig. So I started when I was 26, right?
Everybody's got to dig ditches at some point in their
Yeah.
career.
Well, to be honest, this is not untrue of the UAE. You have hyper-inflated salaries in the UAE, so we were well taken care of. We had a very good
Okay.
package, so that was okay. The only problem for me personally was I went into this knowing that I wasn't going to be a scientist at some point.
Right.
So I remember I had to make some hard choices individually. What is it that I want to do now? Like, I don't have any humanities degree. I don't have any, background behind me whatsoever. So I started doing seminary studies. So I started studying with people online. And that was because just my schedule was very difficult to work with local scholars. So I remember for at least the first 3-4 years, I would only get like 4 hours of sleep. I was like working 18
Yeah.
hours a day.
Where was the seminary? Sorry.
These are online institutions. Privately you can study with scholars, go through books, right? So the way it works is that the seminary system can be very loosely coalesced into an informal program. So what you have is you have a certain number of texts that you need to study with a scholar,
Okay.
and once you finish those texts, you have like a chain of transmission that you study from this scholar going all the way back, etc.
Okay. So this is much more like Jewish rabbinic.
Yeah, exactly
Okay.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's called the isnad. You must have an isnad. You must have a chain of transmission. That you study this book with
Oh,
a certain scholar
fascinating.
recognized,
Okay.
etc. Right?
And so these scholars could be
All over
anywhere
the world, from
for,
the
for
UK.
any given book. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
Wow.
one of my main scholars was actually from Moroccan, and he was the one who I studied Arabic with, classical Arabic with, right?
Right.
He was the one I studied, books on spirituality, jurisprudence, philosophical theology, which is what my main interest came to be eventually. And so I went through that, which was very good. But then in 2017, exactly when things were just right picking up for me, the University of Edinburgh opened up its online MSc in philosophy, science, and religion.
Right. That's a
And I'm
master's of
like,
science
"Yay!"
in
Yeah.
your exact interest.
So this is where I'm now at. I'm at the University of Edinburgh as a lecturer of science and religion. So it feels so surreal to be in this position.
Right.
Going back to 2017, I did the program, and that's when I met Sarah Lane Ritchie. I met Mark Harris. I met all of these guys, right? And I really got to know now, how do you do science or religion? Like they were able to provide some really good access points for people like myself. However, what was frustrating about the program is that it was entirely Christian centric. And that's understandable. That's completely understandable. I mean, like that's the main players in the field are Christian philosophers, theologians. I think Muslim voices were very marginal. There were a few. I mean, you could definitely pick out a few, but very marginal. And by the end of the program, I knew that this was an area that I could potentially contribute to, and I wouldn't lose my training in science as well. That
Right.
could play a big role. So I reached out to Mark. I said, so actually, no, let me take a step back. I wanted to see what was the biggest issue in the Muslim space. And without a doubt, it was evolution. That was like the biggest conversation, in relation to science. So I started penning down some articles, and I reached out to Mark Harris, and who I didn't know at the time, he was the editor of Rutledge's Science Religion series. Right? So I said, look, I have a few articles. I maybe want to stitch this up into a book. Do you have any suggestions? And he said, Shoaib, come to think of it. And then, he mentioned that he's the editor. So
It's like we're looking for such things.
yeah. So, why don't you submit a proposal? And, so Mark has been my mentor, really from day one. I wouldn't be here without him. So I want to give full credit to him for that. And so he kind of walked me through how to do the proposal and everything. And I had zero hopes, like, just a STEM guy, he's got just an MSc behind him. Let's see what comes, right? And I remember 3 months later, I get this email from Rutledge and I was shaking. I remember my hands were shaking and I opened the email and they accepted the proposal. I'm like, whoa,
Wow.
like it was really shocking, really, really shocking for me. I was really taken aback by that.
And I don't think most academics can appreciate. When I used to teach in New York City, I had all these models, actors, and musicians for students.
Right.
And I think they appreciated what it's like to be an academic because they're like, yeah, you go out for, a dozen casting calls and you just get no's across the board. No explanation, just like no, 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 no. And in academics, it's a very no centered because there's just a lot of competition for very limited resources.
Yeah.
So when you see those yeses, even if you haven't got a lot of no's, you know that a yes is a very good thing. So
Yeah. And I was really like, I was like pumped. I was super excited, like, oh, this is happening. But it's around that moment as well that I had to make a decision. So I'm not somebody who can do something 50-50. So I was a chemical engineer during the day, but then I was doing this during night, right? And I just wanted to now get a vote of confidence from someone saying, look, your work is good. So I actually reached out to Mark. If this wasn't a big deal for him, I sent him an email saying, this is going to be the decisive moment for me. If he says, yes, my work is worthy, then I am going to just give this my all, right? I'm just going to fully invest in this and leave chemical engineering behind. So I sent him an email saying, do you think my work is good enough to be able to, have a career in this? And he said, yes, right? Mark was the one who gave me the vote of confidence. If it wasn't for that one email, and this is what I told him in Oxford when we were there a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
So he didn't know that until I mentioned that. I'm like, yeah, if it wasn't for that email, then probably I wouldn't be where I am today. Anyways, that's what gave me the full oomph to start publishing in this space. And then, the book came out, that became recognized by the ISSR, the International Society for Science and Religion. The book also was translated into several languages, something I did not expect. I actually expected a lot of criticism. But I think the main thing was what the book tried to do was really show what was fixed in the science of evolution and what was fixed from the theological side of things, and what are the possible opportunities that these two can communicate with one another.
Right.
And I think so rather than having a one-way ticket, this was more of like an open dialogue, and I think people appreciated that. And that's what allowed me to flourish in the field. It was that one book, And so what happened in 2023, the university that I was in, they had a whole bunch of infrastructural changes that they wanted to implement. I think 200 of us were let go, including myself. And so I was jobless from 2023 to 2024. And then lo and behold, an opportunity comes up. Edinburgh has a vacancy for a lecturer in science and religion. And this is because Mark was here, and then he got the chair at the Ian Ramsay Center at Oxford. So I applied, and I went in believing that I wouldn't make it at all, because I was actually on my way to the States, which is a different conversation now right? So but I went in, did the interview, really enjoyed my time while I was here at Edinburgh. And funny story, when I went back, I literally just went to bed, and then 6 hours later woke up. Within 15 minutes after I woke up, I got a call from the chair, Shoaib, you got it. And I thought I was dreaming, so I had to, stop myself. But but yeah, it turned out to be, I got the position, and then I moved here in July, and it's almost, it's now, it's 8 months in, 8 months into the role.
And it's funny because, I have undergrads all the time that are so worried about getting the right job and getting everything lined up so they can do the career that they hope to do.
Yeah.
And I hear your story, and I had a late switch in careers or later in life. And I'm like, you had a degree, you had a PhD in chemical engineering, and then went back and did a master's so you could explore the possibility of a route, right? Like that's a major shift.
Yeah.
Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters. I think we're glad.
And I forgot
Yeah.
to add to that. I forgot to add to that because I knew that there was a lot of uncertainty in the air. It's one of the reasons why I pursued a second PhD, but this was an unorthodox one. So luck would have it that St. Mary's opened its doors to a PhD by prior publication. And so I wanted one in the humanities, either philosophy or theology. It didn't really matter to me. So they had it in theology and religious studies, and I remember I submitted my work, and within 4 months did the viva, everything, and I got the PhD within
I
4
didn't
months.
even know that part of the story.
Yeah. So they so I think they had like several applicants that came in. I think around 40, 50. And then after internal reviews, only a few got accepted. And I think within that first semester, I think there were only 2 people that were reviewed for a viva, if I'm not mistaken. And then I was the only one that got accepted after the viva. So I was really thankful for that.
A
So again,
viva, for our listeners, a viva is when you defend your thesis against the kind of experts in that field. They come in and they examine you closely and decide whether you are worthy of a PhD or not.
yeah. So that was very, very, again, another contingency. So
Yeah.
there are a set of contingencies built in this that I'm
Which-
just really grateful for.
I have to imagine that a PhD defense in chemical engineering looks very different than a PhD defense in for the humanities.
Yeah. The PhD in chemical engineering was harder.
I can believe that. I remember I went when I was a fellow at St. Andrews in Scotland. I went to they offered these courses for faculty, and one was how to conduct an ethical viva, or an ethical defense as an examiner, and I remember that there were science professors in the room, and someone said something about, well, is it our responsibility to order a meal halfway through? And I looked around going, a meal halfway through? How long do we? And come to find out, theirs were about 8 hours in some fields.
Yeah. Mine went for 3.5
Yeah.
hours.
Which in theology or philosophy, I mean, once you're past the hour and a half mark, it's considered, like you might have problems if it goes any longer than that. So
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's how you got here. I want to go back before we talk about evolution in Islam, but I want to go back to that. What you said is Mark showed you how you do religion and science, and so do you have a quick explanation of better rather than worse ways of how you do religion and science, how you put those two things in conversation?
Yeah. So I don't think there is just like there's no the scientific method,
Right,
there isn't
right.
no one way of doing science and religion. So you could do it historically. So look at historical, events or thinkers that you may be interested in how they're thinking about their theological principles and their natural philosophy. One of the ways of doing it is doing constructive work. So I think this applies to all of the Abrahamic faiths. We have some staple texts that we always fall back on, right? You've got Aquinas in Christianity. You've got
Well, for
Humanities.
some people.
Yeah, for some. In Catholicism.
That's the other thing we discovered in our workshop last week is there are many different Christianities and Christianities within, and many different Islams and Islams within. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So at least you've got certain texts that you follow or authorities that you follow, right? But these authorities are 1,000 years old, and how do you relate those ideas or those authoritative opinions in a contemporary context? So what I got from Mark, in particular, what he was really good at was showing me at least how you can take certain positions, not necessarily confessionally, but as what if models. If you adopt this particular model, what are the implications for this scientific equation, right? Or if you have this particular model, how can you interpret quantum mechanics, for instance, right? So that's the kind of stuff that I got really interested in, because like I said, you can either favor one particular interpretation of a scientific theory and then link it very strongly with your theological model. I find that too limiting, because I think that gets too close to overcommitting yourself, right? And if we've learned anything from the Galileo affair is don't wed yourself to Aristotelian philosophy too much.
That's, well, that part of that story is the part that most people don't know about Galileo. But Yeah, I think that what if thinking. So now I can tell you right now, in Christian circles, especially more religious conservative Christian circles, there's not words that translate across all the faiths. So religious Jew means something different than religious Christian, and but if you think about the more conservative, theologically driven Christian tradition, that give that brings a lot of uncertainty and anxiety because they're like we don't want the what if model of theology. We want the right one,
Yeah.
the singular correct. I'm caricaturing the worst intuitions, but we want the singular correct theology, where I tend to try to convince people that even the Christian scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, tend towards better and worse, not the right one and the wrong one, right? Is that there are better and worse. And so we can just think about what makes the better ones better. So, what do you think makes the better science and religion conversations better? Maybe you can have encountered some things that you think makes them worse as well.
Mm. So
You don't
I
have to
think
call out my book on the worst one.
so I think there are two layers here. So on the one hand, you have the conversation about these intra diversity theological models. So within Christianity, you have competing visions of God,
Right.
creation, and the relationship between the two. Same goes in Islam and Judaism, I'm sure. But then you also have the question of how do you relate those models to these science and religion nexus, right? Like how does that work? My personal approach now is that I believe everyone should have a voice on the table, right? So if you espouse, occasionalism, or if you espouse these different, divine action models, another term that people may not know, but
Right.
it's
Yeah.
just, it's just a way of how God.
Occasional free will models versus God causes everything. Where
Yeah,
you
yeah,
fall
yeah.
on those on
That's a
that
better way of
spectrum.
putting
Yeah.
it. So I think that everyone should have the ability to be able to say, this is where I'm coming from, and that's how I'd interpret a certain, scientific idea. So academically, I think I would be a pluralist. I would say that everyone should be able to express those things, because I'm not too interested in closing off a certain theological school just because I disagree with that school. I think we've done that for 1,000 years. It hasn't really gotten us anywhere, apart from another set of books that may be collecting dust in a few hundred years from now. So I think that we have to accept that there are differences of opinions. That's the first thing, which I think some people find it hard to do because they have a very confessional way of approaching these. But I think that's what needs to happen. You need to be very clear and forthcoming with what your metaphysics is, what your epistemology is, and then let us walk us through your journey, walk us through your model. And I think that is a better way going forward. So I don't necessarily say that I disagree with this because of that. I'll say that from this particular model that would be considered problematic because of da 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 da, and that's I think a better way. But I think that just criticizing someone just because you have that theological difference, I don't think that's the space for science religion. I think that's pure theology as opposed to science religion.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And even there, you sound more like a mathematician to me than even a scientist, in the sense of, there's a freedom in mathematics just to throw every model on the table and kind of see what sticks, or keep one around that you're not even sure what it's good for, but maybe later on it becomes handy to somebody.
Right, right. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is my mature thought, right? I wasn't like this when I was younger in the
Right,
field.
right.
So when you're in a seminary system in particular, there's a hidden curriculum. Don't step out of these X, Y, Z red lines, which I'm sure several Christians and Jews can also see. But I think that if you want to really advance the field, one of the ways you do that is by allowing different voices to come forward, because it's only through disagreements that you can have more sophistication, right? I mean, we're not going to get Aquinas or Augustine or Ghazali or Avicenna if they didn't have their precursors that they were responding to, right? I mean, Maimonides, he was responding to certain people in his context, right? You can see that in his, Guide to the Perplexed. So I think that in order to have that level, you need to be able to have the environment to let dialogues flow, let conversations flow. But I appreciate that some people may not like that attitude precisely because they feel that it may harm, their faith, or maybe harm the wider society's faith, right? I think that those are valid concerns. However, I think there's a big distinction now between where we are today in history versus where we were. We are now a knowledge-centric civilization,
Hmm.
right? Knowledge is no longer limited to bricks and mortar. It's wherever the electrons go now over the optic wires. And so I think that you can shield yourself however much you want to, but knowledge is out there. It's all there. And I think rather than being afraid of it, we have to, I think, create attitudes where we can say, okay, I haven't given this much thought. Let me retreat and think about it. Or, okay, let me see what you're saying. And I may not agree, but I just want to have a sense of where this is coming from. That's the kind of attitude I think I'd like to foster in the field.
Yeah. And I think there's two different approaches. Again, there can be more than this, but that kind of don't go outside of the bounds thinking, which is this is correct and outside of the bounds is dangerous, versus let's just kind of explore here. And through that exploration, we will probably all in some way fall back within a boundary. Maybe it was the original boundary we were within, right? We go out there, we look, and we're like, you know what? Those options aren't as great as we thought they were. They don't work out as much as we thought. Um, yeah, I think,
That's my approach. That's personally my approach. So
yeah,
I stick to a personal school that I think, at least to me, makes the most sense. Like it's the best theological approximation that I can have of God, creation, that whatever systematic thoughts you want to have in there. And I say, okay, let me see what this model says, and if I disagree, I'll just come back to that. But I think so you need an anchor. I think that's the key
right.
thing. You definitely need an anchor to start off with.
Yeah.
I think where the problem is that in science or religion, because you are opening up three big bodies simultaneously, the science, philosophy, and religion,
Yeah.
particularly for people who don't have an anchor, they may feel a bit, whoa, this is, where am I
Hmm.
going here? So I have seen that with some students as well. So,
Yeah.
so you've got to be careful, I think, with how you manage those conversations.
Yeah. And, even simple things like I teach undergrads quite often, and the young men and women, like their frontal lobes haven't finished developing yet, right? Like that, they're still stuck a little bit in black and white thinking, and gray is it's emotionally and cognitively difficult for them. So you have to take all of those things into account as we walk people into these discussions.
Yeah.
That said, assuming that we have some cognitively mature people listening to you today, you come or you. I've noticed that your work tends to favor the Asharite school, and within Sunni Islam, if that is that correct? Okay, so maybe you could just really quick for somebody who's never heard of Islam. I don't know how often you do this, but do you have a thumbnail explainer like, here's the deal, like Islam? What's the deal with that, right? Here's the deal with Islam. Here's how it's split up. We could say maybe we just say, what's your thumbnail for Shia versus Sunni, and then how has Islam like entered the intellectual world over time?
Yeah. So you're asking for like long, detailed
Yeah, yeah.
explanation.
Just summarize the entire history of a very complex tradition.
Right. So I would say like the thumbnail understanding of Islam is that it sees itself as the final word of God, as a successor and an abrogator of the religions that come before it. So primarily Judaism and Christianity. It actually refers to those two religions very explicitly in the text. The prophet is Prophet Muhammad, and the God that is depicted is not an Arab God as is sometimes misunderstood. It's not specifically for the Arabs, or it's not specifically for that region. It's the God of everyone, of
Mhm.
everything, right? Just because it has an Arab sounding name, Allah, people I think misunderstand that its depiction.
Which, for listeners, I want to refer back to an episode with Jerry Huang, who's an Old Testament scholar who has a whole chapter in his book on why Allah is actually a Hebrew. It's a Hebrew appropriate term that the biblical authors would be completely on board with using about God.
Oh, okay, cool,
Yeah.
very good. Now, where the separation comes into play, it's very early on in the history. It's to do with the correct succession after the prophet. So the Sunni school of thought is has the opinion that the prophet never made any declarative assertions on who would be the successor.
Hmm.
So it would be open up for democracy. Ironically, that word doesn't sit so well in the minds of many in relation to Islam. So,
Right, right.
right. So, but yeah, it's supposed to be an open conversation. There should be a council of sorts that chooses the next leader. Whereas for the Shi'i school of thought, it's through the lineage of the nephew of the Prophet who married the daughter of the Prophet Fatima. And it's their lineage through which you have these infallible imams that come in that are meant to be the caliphs or the leaders of the Muslim world. And this is where you see that tension emerge from, a few generations after the Prophet's
Yeah.
death, right? So that's like the thumbnail version
Yeah.
of two. So that's what I'd say
That's
the
a very
big.
good thumbnail, by the way.
I'm glad. Okay, so good.
Good job.
Okay, good.
Thumbs up.
All
Two
right, good.
thumbnails up.
Right. In the contemporary world, if you wanted like a percentage reference, so just the latest surveys that I've seen, between 80 to 85% of the Muslim world is Sunni, and 20 to 15% is Shi'i, right? And I would say the hotspot of the Shi'i, camp is Iran at the moment, right? And the Sunni world is dispersed all over, though you'll find Shi'is, several places throughout. So if you go to the UK, for instance, you can easily see, okay, that's a Shia mosque, that's a Sunni mosque. You'll be able to see because they even have some differences in the way they pray. So you'll notice that, for the most part, Sunnis pray here. They're not excluded. They also pray on their sides. But one of the key distinctions you can perhaps make is for Sunnis, usually they pray with their hands here in their front. With Shias, it's on the sides.
Oh,
So they don't,
I didn't know that.
yeah. So if you ever go to a mosque, if most of the people are praying on their sides, most likely it's not always the case because there is one school within the Sunni world where you're allowed to pray like this on the sides, right? So just those are some differences that come up. Unfortunately, just like with every other intra-religious disagreement, there has been bloodshed over history, and I think that's nothing specific to Islam.
Definitely not.
Politics come into play, economics come into play. But where I think that, coming in now to your third question, which is what is the intellectual history? This is where I think we're now seeing a reversion of the long shadow of Orientalism that still haunts the academy, right? So in the 1850s, when Orientalism started popping up across, North American universities and European ones as well, the Orient was seen as an amazing object of study, but they had certain assumptions with how they approached that study. So the Muslim world is barbaric, it's stupid, doesn't have a philosophical tradition, and so that became really the axes for how people viewed that perspective. That region. I think over time, in the past few decades, now things are slowly, being revised in that people are finding out, oh, there are all these amazing scholars that Islam has, right? They've got Ghazali, they've got Razi, they've got Avicenna, for example, And so what was initially thought was just a mere or a passive reception of ideas. So there's two translation movements that happen. In the 9th century, right, there's a whole flux of information and books coming in that are being translated into Arabic from from Hinduism, from Farsi, from all these other Latin languages as well, right? And so they're coming into Arabic, and the general opinion a couple of decades ago was that Muslims just held on to this and it was translated back.
Right.
But now they're realizing it wasn't just a passive reception; it was an active engagement. And so now you're finding all these cool texts, like, for example, the one that I hold here. This is a scholar that I'm studying, Fakhruddin al-Razi, who had amazing insights in how he was integrating and dealing with Neoplatonic thought, Aristotelian ideas in his theological matrix. So I think there's now a huge interest in the history of Islam. And I think that people are now slowly filling in the gaps, which were huge a couple of decades ago. So I think that there's now a growing recognition that there is an intellectual backbone, and I think that is where we are at the moment. And my role in that conversation is I'm trying to show how these ideas can be instrumentalized today for science and religion.
Right. I think it's worth mentioning, since we're going to talk about evolution here in a second, it's not by accident that Orientalism and evolutionary theory are doing similar moves, in the sense of there's this progressivist and evolutionist movement in the West that basically says we've moved from, and most people will recognize it, something like the caveman to the civilized man.
Right.
And so when anthropologists went out and studied the world, they looked at people who they thought looked like cave people. So these were uncivilized people because they didn't have concrete houses, or they didn't have advanced tools or something. And so this kind of primitive society versus civilized society actually became the tool for oppressing a lot of people, right? It became the justification, because we're civilized. We need to teach these people how to be civilized, and they'll be our workforce in the meantime. So yeah, this wasn't just merely an idea that they were primitive people. It had real world horrible implications for a lot of people, as some versions of progressivism still do to this day. Um, okay, so let's get to two questions. Where are Muslims on the science religion conversation? Like as a whole, where is Muslim scholarship on that topic? And then, or how do they rate themselves? And then, secondly, where is like on the street? I don't know if we can talk about the Arab street anymore, but the kind of on the street view of evolution amongst Muslims.
Okay, I think let's start with the first one, but I think we need to have a historical starting point to be able to appreciate where we are today. I would say that discussions about Islam and modern science, so I'm not talking about Aristotelian science, but modern science, I would say you would find those conversations starting in the 1900s, right? Early 1900s. Now, why this is an exciting area is because you have people who are beginning to recognize, the intelligentsia that is, that the Muslim world is clearly falling behind. And you've got to bear in mind that 150 years ago, none of the Muslim countries that you and I know existed. There was no such thing as the UAE. There was no such thing as Thailand, Indonesia. All of that was, the caliphate, the Muslim caliphate, which dissolved in 1924. And this was because of colonization and a host of problems. So
Right.
the first,
Those states were drawn by largely Western powers. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, right. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the ideas of the scholars of the time, they were looking at science as a comparative study between Islam and Christianity. So what makes the West so powerful? And I think one of the clearest, points of attachment was Christianity. Maybe it's their religion that makes them better scientists than us. So the first few scholars that started talking about science and religion were people who wanted to really improve the Muslim world by, raising this idea of progression. We need to learn the foreign sciences. We need to learn the Western sciences. Otherwise, we're going to fall behind. And so you even have books. So there's one famous guy. So Al-Azhar is like, you could say, one of the many Vaticans of the Muslim world. We don't have a central authority. We have hegemonic authorities, right? So in Egypt, Azhar, one of the longest, oldest universities in the Muslim space. And he was the Grand Mufti. Like he was the rector, right? And so he had this book called Islam and Christianity in Relation to Civilization and Science, right? And interestingly, in that book, he shows, or he tries to show, that Islam is better than Christianity because of all these blunders in the past. And guess what? I don't think you know this, Drew. His ideas were sourced from John William Draper, the conflict guy. Yeah. So that means John William Draper's ideas made their way into Arabic or somehow to Abdu, to that scholar, right?
Wow.
So, you get stuff like that. And so I think that the initial discussion was all about how we need to think ahead, how we need to move beyond, how we need to kind of be able to take in these new sciences. And so what happened after 1924, when the caliphate dissolved, nation states started emerging. And naturally, a big part of nation state development is education. And how do you stay competitive? You need the modern sciences. So there's this huge importation of curricula from the US, from Canada, from the UK. And so in the next 50 years or so, that's what's happening. Now in the 1980s, this is when we begin to see what I refer to as the crystallization of Islam and science as a discourse. This is where I would, put it. And so you have these two opposing trends that you see. One trend is known as the Islamization of science, which is a very interesting movement. So this is a movement that started off by a few scholars, and it had two basic premises. One, that science, at least the way it's currently taught, is Western, it's alien, it's modern. And two, it needs to be purged through Islamic lenses, whatever those Islamic lenses were, right? And they disagreed about what that really means, right? So you have this ultra suspiciousness about modern science coming in, right? And that's why you have this, sometimes if you go to the Muslim world, you have these, very strong bifurcations, the West versus Islam, which is similar to the, clash of civilizations narrative that you see, right?
Right.
So that's one, I think, conversation that you have. The other conversation that you have around this period is The complete opposite. Oh, all these modern scientific ideas, we have them in the Quran. They're right here. The Big Bang, it's there in the Quran. It's except for evolution, but everything is there, right? Everything is there, right? Or you're
I have a
talking.
feeling this is going to lead to the second question.
Yeah, yeah. So what's really interesting to me, that the formation of Islam and science as a discourse, and my measuring stick for what a discourse is when you start seeing books, conferences, and academic production emerging in a very concentrated way. And I think that's really the space for me, 1980s. So you have two diametric movements, one being very suspicious of modern science and one being very friendly with modern science, right? Now, from the 1980s to the 2000s, this was, I think, the reigning dominant way of thinking about these two. After 2000s, you get then a second generation of scholarship. This is where people like Nidal come in, Nidal Qassoum, Basil al-Ta'i, and a few others, like a handful of scholars, I would say still less than 10, that are now talking about, more local inquiries. So how does quantum mechanics work within the Islamic space, right? How does evolution work in the Islamic space, right? Islamic psychology starts maturing, right? Islamic psychology, to one extent, can be seen as a branch of the Islamization sphere by saying that contemporary psychological frameworks are too secular. They don't cater for the soul or for the spirit, hence why we need an Islamic psychology, right? So in effect, what you're getting is more local focused inquiries and moving away from like meta narratives.
Right.
And this aligns itself to some extent with the whole Christian development around this time, in that we want to move away from big picture stuff and start getting into science engaged theology, which is what the term that Joanna is propagating. And I think that makes sense within the Islamic space after 2000s. So that's the second generation. The third generation is when you're seeing now in the past few years is now we're able to see the development of the infrastructure of Islam and science. So till today, we don't have a single textbook on Islam and science. We have 14 from the Christian perspective. Till today, right? Also on top of that, you don't have any university courses on Islam and science. Like nothing like that exists. You don't have dedicated departments. But if you look at the Christian side of it, Zygon, the world's leading journal for science religion, started off in 1966, right? The first textbook, Ian Barber, Issues in Religion and Science, 1960s as well, right? And so you see this amazing like movement and development. You get chairs being dedicated to science or religion from the Christian side, but you don't see any of that. And that's because I think there has not been a sense of clarity of who's doing it. Has there been enough critical threshold behind this kind of thing? Economics come into play, sensitivities come into play. And so I think that's the reason why it's been relatively slow. So I'd say this is the first time we have somebody now who's at a university whose job is full-time developing the field of Islam and science. I'd say that's the first time we're having this space. 2023 was a very interesting year because in this year you now see the inauguration of two series. One is the Cambridge Elements Islam and Science series that is being co-edited by Stefano Bigliardi and Nidal Qassoum, and Palgrave's Islam and Science monograph series, which is what I'm editing. In addition to that, I'm also editing Palgrave's Encyclopedia on Islam and Science. So you can see here now the infrastructure slowly coming into play. And a few days ago, we found out that the University of Edinburgh, which has both an in-person as well as an online science religion program, our proposal for having a whole course on Islam and science to be part of that program was accepted by the Board of Studies.
Wow.
And that's now accessible.
Is that going to be the first one ever?
First one, I would say first one by a university that's accessible to everyone. Russell Group as well, right? So you have that. As far as I can tell, it's the first one of its kind.
Yeah.
Right.
Russell Group means Ivy League for Americans.
Oh yeah, for that.
Shoaib taught me that a few weeks ago.
Yeah. So
I mean, it's astounding in some ways. I would have assumed. Honestly, I would have assumed this, having read Islamic philosophers, in philosophy classes back in my master's degree. I would have just assumed they would have been on top of this. Okay, so I think we got some hints about where evolution is going to fit in here, and how evolution might even be part of this historical development.
Yeah. So, interestingly, again, 1900s, right? Evolution actually, I think, was largely shaped by Christian seminaries that were developed in the Middle East. right? So remember when you had Christian missionaries that set up their own institutions, and those would be the main learning hubs for where people want to go for the latest knowledge of the day. So I don't think you know this. Have you ever been to Lebanon, Drew, by any chance?
I have not yet. Yeah.
Right. So one of the best universities in the Middle East, one of the best probably, is AUB, American University of Beirut. It was the Syrian Protestant college.
Right.
Right? That was its origin. It was a Syrian Protestant college.
Right. Arab Christian.
Yeah. Arab Christian, yeah. And so, naturally, some of the developments that were taking place in the West started influencing scholars in how they were being seen, because of these seminaries or just because of the material that was being translated from whatever language into Arabic, right? So you get the usual, in the early days, evolution was seen as a communist, Marxist theory, right? That was some of the responses you find in the 1920s, 40s, 50s, right? Then it started getting linked to atheism and materialism. You find those expressions as well. I think more recently, anyone who's tried to attempt to talk about evolution positively, you immediately get accused of being a sellout, a progressivist, right? You're revising the tradition and all of that. So evolution is a very, very sensitive topic. And I can say this now very comfortably. In my previous employment, when we were going through orientation, we were told to stay away from 3 topics in the classroom. One was evolution. And that's because a year before, it was a professor of biology, he was an American, he got not only fired for teaching evolution, but deported from the country.
Okay.
Yeah. So serious, very serious, right?
Yeah.
So now the way
And that was in the UAE?
That was in the UAE.
Which is
one of the most
in
liberal
political terms, is a pretty liberal political country. Yeah.
But the flashiness of that country is more to do with technological production. But with theoretical ideas, you have to be careful who and when you say it to, right?
Very interesting.
Now, so the way the biology teachers got around that, because you have to teach evolution, it's in the books, right? You can't just get rid of it. So the way the teachers got around, this is a clever response. So they just eliminated the words Darwin and evolution. And whenever they presented, they'd say, this is the theory of change. And that's it.
Perfect.
Right, yeah.
I've actually done something very similar in my own life. I used to call what I did, the biblical theology of epistemology, but that's a forbidden term in a lot of biblical studies. Biblical theology is a forbidden term. So I just started calling it the intellectual world of the Hebrew Bible, and people are like, oh, the very same people who are like, you can't do that. You just rephrase it, and they're like, oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So maybe you could give us, as we're running out of time here, maybe you could give us one example of questions that Muslim scholars are going to, like you, are going to put to evolutionary theory that maybe Christians or Jews would not. Something that highlights the distinctiveness of the Muslim intellectual tradition. And I know in some ways they're all bound together at various points in history. They come to these juncture points because of the Baghdad University that you pointed to.
Yeah. Beirut, not Baghdad. Baghdad is in Iraq.
Sorry. Well, the University of Baghdad, where a lot of this scholarship, the medieval scholarship, is.
Right. Yeah. That's true.
Where if you wanted to go to the Oxford of the world, then you went to Baghdad, not because Oxford, they were still in mud huts, I think then. But is there a question that Muslims are going to ask about evolution that is going to be unique to them?
No, I would say that there are actually there are more questions in Christianity than there are in Islam, right? Because you've got to bear in mind that Muslims have, at least on the whole Adamic front, there are less commitments. So, for example, Muslims don't believe in original sin.
Right.
So they had no problem if there were things that were going through suffering, or if there was evil before Adam, no problem there. In fact, the Quran is very clear about that there was killing and bloodshed before Adam, right? So I don't think that's a commitment that Muslims hold, and I think I can say that very comfortably, across the board, right? And so therefore, there's no need for redemption, the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. Whereas those are very important conversation points, particularly for traditional Christians, right? Evangelicals in particular are really honed in on that. So I would say there are more set of commitments there than there are on the Muslim side. In fact, I would say that most of the skepticism regarding evolution is actually shared between the two religions, right? So you have a huge ID crowd in the Muslim world, and most of it was borrowed from the creationist literature that you find in American bodies, right?
Intelligent design.
Yeah, intelligent design, as well as creationist material. You'll find both, right? So I think that's there. But is there something idiosyncratic to the Islamic faith that I can pinpoint? I don't think so. The rest of the
I think
challenges
the original sin's a big one, though.
huge, huge.
Yeah, that would.
But that's not a commitment within Islam. You're asking
Yeah.
something. Is there a commitment within Islam? No, I can't
Yeah.
really think of something that's idiosyncratic to them.
What about even things like the depiction in Genesis? So this would be for Judaism and Christianity in some ways, of God like being in a garden, digging with his, planting plants and trees and sculpting a man out of dirt.
Right.
Would that be problematic for Islam?
So I think that scripturally there are some radical differences here.
Okay.
So Islam is very, very, I would say the mainstreams at least, they're very radically, transcendent in their thinking about God, right? So
Meaning God has to be completely other.
Yeah, he's just this other, completely radically other entity, right?
So Jesus doesn't make sense on so many fronts in Islam, right?
And
Yeah.
as we saw in Oxford a few days,
Yeah.
like Hajj Day has zero, compassion within the Islamic faith. Like there's no this doesn't make sense. It's so alien to the Muslim mind.
Right.
And that's because we believe that God is so transcendent that he cannot be involved, at least like a human, on the day-to-day affairs of the world. He's controlling everything moment to moment, but he is not everything, or he's not a part of everything.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, I hate to end there because that's just a taster at this point of some of your great thought. Maybe we'll have to have you back on to explain some more because I'm sure people are going to want to hear more. So you are the lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in Religion and Science, and people can actually come study with you, right?
Yeah. I mean, we have both in-person as well as online MSc programs and PhD options as well. So, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You can email me at shoaib.malik@ed.ac.uk, or just go to the website if it's easier.
Yeah.
So,
And it doesn't have to be Muslim studying anything under Islam, anything.
no.
with religion is
I
right,
mean,
right, yeah.
I've also launched a new course on AI and theology, which is not bound to any one religion. It's just a generic course on how AI is going to impact theological conversation, which is another episode we should do, Drew.
We should do something on AI because the things I've learned lately have blown my mind a little bit. So, all right, Shoaib, thank you so much for your wisdom. And I think you can hear just from my chat with him here that why he is such a great colleague to work with on this project that we talked about in the last episode. So thank you, Shoaib, for your time and your wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Drew.